Armstrong Williams, welcome to Explorations in Black Leadership.
Thank you for inviting me.
We're very pleased to have you here. I want to begin with some questions about the Brown decision. Now, it occurred 5 years before you were born, but what was the discussion, if any, in your family, or what was the feeling about what this might mean?
You know, my parents had quite a different take on the government and the issues of race. My father actually, in their discussions, actually thought it was ridiculous that the highest court in the land even had to come to the conclusion of discussion that separate but equal was immoral. He always saw things in terms of moral and immoral, and that they had the discussion to make a decision to try to make the facilities equal. And his attitude was, son, you know, they can try for the next 20 or 30 years to make the facilities equal, but the only way my children are going to have a quality education is that I got to ensure that it happens. That I got to make sure that I'm involved with what happens before they ever enter kindergarten, by reading to them, having them read to us, reading the newspaper, going to the library. I will never trust the government to ever educate my children or to make me believe that they're going to make people equal. How are you going to have, from human slavery, today jury segregation, and now this Brown versus Board, and then we're going to get into the civil rights movement, and how do you think that we're going to be equal? You cannot legislate the mentality of people. When people felt in the beginning that you were unequal and therefore you were not worthy to sit next to their kid because that kid was white or something else. As he discussed it in a different way. I've got to make sure that my children are educated and have a better chance at life than what I have.
Where did this idea come from in his family? Why do you think he felt that way?
Well, you know, my father and mother had deeply held Christian values. My father often talked about the stories that were passed along to them about how people who considered themselves to be God-fearing would go to church on Sunday, but yet after church could have a picnic and cut up their brethren into pieces and place them in a jar and have just left the altar of God. And how could anyone who claimed they believed in God, their actions were just that of brutality, of something that goes against all the teachings that they proclaimed to believe in. And so his attitude is that, you know, it's going to be quite some time before you can ever change the hearts of men who allowed a constitution in place that in ideas and in principles we were equal, but they did not have the moral turpitude or the moral courage to stand up and say, we have to learn from the brutal dictatorships of the past to make people equal, have equal access. We don't have to give someone an advantage, but don't give them a disadvantage. So my father never had a whole lot of faith in the government, and I had a whole lot of faith with people who subscribed to a certain faith and who had certain power. There was nothing in his history that would make him believe that they would do anything that was good in the long run. He figured long after he would leave this earth that things would be better, but he did not see it happening within the next 30 or 40 years during that time.
But at the same time, when you write about the Brown decision on the 50th anniversary, on the 50th anniversary year, you write that life was far better for my brothers and sisters than when I came along. How did your brothers and sisters, you're from a family of 9, how did they benefit, if at all, from the Brown decision?
Well, separate but equal. The notion is that when the decision was rendered, is that you can no longer believe that just because you're separate, you've got to make you equal. Many of these institutions were still unequal. Unequal in terms of what they had access to, in terms of the teachers, and even just in the rural part of the world that we lived in. I mean, we did not have access to the kind of tax base as a lot of people who had a certain kind of affluency had. Obviously, my father thought it was a good thing that people were beginning to understand what many of them have known for a long time, that racism and discrimination and bigotry of any kind is a moral sin and the stain of this country that we all will have to pay a price for, the oppressor and the oppressed. I think my father's attitude was what he learned is that as the government was giving all this rhetoric about making people equal, what he needed to do was find a farm, find an institution where he could raise his children sort of like an incubator, so he can influence their value system, their work ethic, their discipline, their routine, to teach them how to work, to teach them how to fish. As he was building his farm, my parents had a 250-acre farm they bought back during the 1940s. That farm still is in the family today. So my father felt the best weapon to bigotry and discrimination would be being truly free, because my father grew up partly on the sharecropper's farm, and he talked about the abuse, the humiliation. He told a story about how his brother, I don't know if you know this, you may know this, I mean, you're well read and you certainly have far more experience than most people on this issue, is that I remember a story about his uncle who had worked on this man's farm, and they only paid them once a year. Was when they were paid, once a year. And they worked on this farm for a year, and I had a friend of mine recall this story for me recently, and it reminded me of something my father said. And at the end of the year, the owner of the farm said, "We owe you about $46. And I mean, it was just an outrage. I mean, this man had worked, I mean, the blisters, the sores for an entire year, and for someone to say that you only owed less than $100 was an insult. And from those lessons from my father watching his brothers, he said, you know, I may have to endure that for some time, but the children I bring in the world will never endure that kind of humiliation and abuse, because it could just destroy their self-esteem. I never even realizing that every opportunity in America could possibly be their opportunity.
Now, before we began taping, we talked just for a moment, and you said that in your father's